Well, if you're part of the what I call the Netanyahu Zelensky slash Trump triumvirate, because they're in a triangular relationship right now, whether they like it or not. I think there is a view that on one side in the West, the European leaders, the globalists that are running the show, want to believe that they're having a big impact on Russia. You had 800 drones that managed to penetrate air defenses and ultimately reach targets in Moscow, Volgograd, and another city and do some damage. It's not so lethal that it's putting Russia at risk of going under by any means, although you'd think so listening to the reports. But these 800 drones were a product of British technology provided to the Ukrainians. They had new engines in them. They could fly further, faster. They came in at about 20 feet above the treetops. By the time Russian radars identified them, it was too late. They'd already flown past. And they reached most of their targets without much difficulty. This is more than just an irritant now for Mr. Putin and his government. There are a lot of Russians who are genuinely angered by the whole process. And of course, they've been angered for some time and want this war to end, but this, I think, has added fuel to the fire. It's also raised the questions in various people's minds, how much more do the Russians take of this nonsense before they finally strike back at the locations where these drones are manufactured in places like Germany or Britain or France or otherwise. Actually, I don't think anything's coming out of France that's very significant right now. So that's one dimension. There's another dimension right now that a lot of people aren't watching, and that is the developments certainly down in the Southwest. The Russians are now on the outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. The bridge in Zaporizhzhia, the one that people pointed to for a long time as being very significant, structurally very sound, is being damaged. It's not being destroyed. But a lot of Russians for a long time have wondered why all the bridges had not been dropped. The argument was, well, we may want to use them on the way back, but that hasn't held up to closer scrutiny given how long everything has taken. But frankly, if there's one thing the Russians can do well, it's throw bridges over rivers. So if this thing turns out to be unusable, I don't think it makes much difference. But what it suggests is that the noose around Odessa has been tightened considerably. And that is, of course, a lifeline for Ukraine, which is already on life support as it is. That means it's dependent entirely on everything that comes to it through Lithuania or primarily Poland. And of course, Mr. Zelensky's relationships with Warsaw are pretty terrible. The Poles are fed up. They would like to export as many of the Ukrainians as they've got that they can. And at the same time, they're deeply offended by Zelensky's remarks and behavior. Not a good thing for the Ukrainians. I think the population of Ukraine is at least 50% of what it was at the beginning and falling. I'm told there are as many as 10 million so-called old age pensioners. That's not a good sign. And as you pointed out earlier, dragging them into uniform and shipping them east to sit in a trench is a waste of time. Russian forces on the ground are moving very consistently, and I think they'll soon be on the Dnieper River. Of course, I expected that to happen a lot earlier, as did most people. Now, there is an interesting development that's worth mentioning. I'm told by my sources that Gerasimov, that is Colonel General Gerasimov, Chief of the General Staff, will be at the end of his tenure by the middle of September as Chief of the Russian General Staff. A lot of people are wondering what that means. There aren't very many rumors with any substance circulating. But we need to understand that Gerasimov was a key figure in the Prigozhin drama and wanted Prigozhin dead as soon as possible. He subsequently had at least one major general, Russian major general, jailed for effectively challenging him and his conduct of the war. As far as I know, he's alive and still sitting in jail, much to the shame of President Putin, who I think should release the man. I can go back and find out what his name is. But Gerasimov, let's put it this way, is not a particularly popular figure. A lot of people in Russia blame him for the slow, ponderous conduct of the operation. But we have to keep in mind that back in 2021, he was extended for an additional 5 years as Chief of the General Staff, and he's still there, which means that whatever he's done has been comfortable with Putin's outlook. So the question, what happens now? We had all of these speeches that President Putin gave not long ago, insisting, I want an acceleration of operations. I want more offensive action. Everybody gave him a resounding series of applauses. The question is that really meaningful? One source that I trust said, well, there are a lot of people wondering if the Surovikin, who is back from Africa and had a very widely publicized and happy office call with Putin, is now going to come out of the dark, step into the light, and become the next chief of the general staff. Others have said, no, he's an Air Force officer. That's very unlikely. They'll want another Army general. I don't know, but when this replacement is made, that will tell us a lot about where things are going to go from now on, because Gerasimov has always been associated with a sort of Soviet hangover, the slow, deliberate, methodical way to do business. And that's not something that Putin says he wants. That's not something that the average Russian wants. They want decisive action. So I think when this decision is made, whoever shows up, that'll tell us a lot about where things are headed. But clearly, the Russians are now positioned with all the troops and all the equipment and all the capabilities they need to be very successful. And then finally, this fear of the Europeans entering the war, I don't think it's dissipated, but it has certainly lost some airspeed and altitude. I think there's a growing awareness that the Europeans aren't capable of putting up much and getting much into the fight. In fact, one of my sources tells me that they're more concerned about the use of modernized aircraft, potentially over Ukraine against Russian forces, and they're concerned about any ground force that might show up. And I think it's pretty obvious that since we're having trouble conducting one campaign down in the Middle East against Iran, and we're already running low on all the munitions and capabilities that we would like to have, that our Navy is already overstretched because it's much smaller than it has been in the past. It's very unlikely that if something were to happen in Ukraine, it would cause that state to finally collapse and Russian forces to cross the Dnieper River, that we would do anything, which means the Europeans would be on their own. And the real question is, would the Europeans do anything beyond what they've talked about? I don't think so. And I don't think so because I don't think the Poles would support it. The Polish population doesn't want it. The government is now sick of Zelensky. And if you don't have Poland firmly in your camp, willing to provide you with a base of operations, forget it. A lot of people don't realize that back in 1981, when they declared martial law in Poland in December, and they put Jaruzelski in charge, I'm talking about Moscow, that within a few weeks, there was a Politburo meeting involving Brezhnev and his colleagues, and Kulikov, who was really the Western theater commander, Soviet commander. They called him the Warsaw Pact commander, but that was always a joke. There was never a building for the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a facade. It was the Soviet armed forces, and then you had non-Soviet forces inside Soviet armed forces. So Kulikov was in command of everything, and he gave a very blunt speech at the time, and he said, any offensive operations by our forces against the West is now impossible. And everybody sort of sat up and looked. Why? Well, very simple. Poland is in disarray. Poland is not a reliable base of support. We have to reckon with a very high possibility that if we were to launch an offensive, that the Poles would hinder it, would obstruct, would disrupt. So until we can be absolutely certain that Poland will be firmly in our camp and order is totally restored, we've got to forget any notion of offensive operations. Now, at the time, that was very sensitive intelligence, but it was true. And what's really funny is that we continued to talk right up until the bitter end, when the Soviet state falls apart, about this imminent Soviet offensive operation. And there was no chance whatsoever for that to happen after 81. So Poland is once again playing a very important role, and we should not ignore that. So whatever the German government or the British government or the French government or anybody else says, it's absurd. Forget it. Write it off. It's not going to happen. I think that's beginning to sink in at high levels for the Russians. So we'll have to see who shows up as the next chief of the general staff. But I would think September would be a very important month. Now, what we don't know is how much rain we're going to get, how muddy and miserable it's going to become. We'll have to wait and see. But as long as the ground is reasonably dry as it is at the moment, they could do a lot in September.
Well, if the Russians, well, first of all, they would like to do some vengeance on the Europeans due to their growing involvement, direct involvement in this war. And as you said, they're also doubting that they would want a direct war with Russia. How do you see this impacting Russia's strategy on the fronts? Because again, the Surovikin, which they call General Armageddon, obviously he's for a much more aggressive approach, but this also seems to be the growing consensus that the former slow grinding war of attrition should be changed. I'm not sure simply because the war is entering a different phase, but we do see now all these attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, the bridges, ports, quite brutal attacks on Kyiv itself. We see threats of seizing European ships in response to, well, them seizing Russian ships. We see the North Koreans possibly entering in a much bigger way in this war. And the Russians are attacking targets which they didn't do before due to collateral damage. And, well, essentially it's becoming much more, I would say, ruthless now. Do you think it's possible that there's a strategic shift where the Russians might be going for a knockout blow towards the end as they see their adversary being weakened?
Well, I'm told there are now at least 20,000 North Korean troops in the theater, and there may be more. The North Koreans are anxious to get some combat experience. The Russians are happy to have the additional manpower. But we should also understand that the Russians have a lot of manpower as it is. I mean, their force has grown dramatically, and they are training about 150,000 reserves right now. I do think the Russians smell blood. I think they know that Ukraine is a fatally wounded animal. And they're not so much worried about what the Ukrainians might do as they advance. They're much more worried about the Europeans, obviously, as you point out. But I think the fear that this could result in a larger conflagration is beginning to dissipate. So I think the Russians, who are sick to death of these sort of pinprick operations that have now grown into something more than pinpricks, knife strikes, if you look at the 38% reduction in refining capability and the fact that the Russians have suspended the export of refined oil and, in the form of gasoline, diesel, and other distillates, that suggests there's been an impact. Obviously not on the scale, once again, that the hopeful voices in Washington, London, and Paris and Berlin want to laud. Privately, I think everybody knows it's only a matter of time until Ukraine is dead as a nation state. It's already a zombie. So the question is, what are they going to do next? How much are they willing to do? And I think we're going to find that out with Gerasimov's replacement. That's going to tell us a lot. Because I think it would be wise now, if they're going to take serious action, to do so. But, we don't know what else is on President Putin's mind. I would, as an American, my view would be, if they do a great deal now, we cannot do much about it. And Trump knows that, I think. Has that entered into his broader strategic calculus? That I can't tell, but I think he's well aware that, we're not in a position to take on the Russian armed forces over a place like Ukraine. We're stretched very thin right now in too many ways in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean.
Well, even if the Russians think that NATO countries won't intervene when Ukraine finally begins to collapse, it nonetheless needs, it can't base its strategy on hope. It has to prepare for the possibility of war. Now, we've seen the shift in the nuclear doctrine and all, but do you see any other indications that the Russians are preparing for a possible war with NATO? Because, from what I hear, they're producing a lot of Oreshniks, but we're not seeing them on the front line. They're developing a lot of armored vehicles. We're not seeing them either. Is this for a later stage in Ukraine, or do you think that's intended for us?
I don't think it's intended for us, per se. When you say us, you're talking about NATO, I guess. but it will be ready for NATO if NATO decides to intervene. They've always held forces, large forces, well-equipped forces in reserve. I think that's more true now than in the past. I mean, why would you commit the bulk of your capability if you think there's any chance that someone from NATO could intervene? So they've always had their eyes on Moldova, on Poland, the Polish border, Lithuania, and so forth. My point is that I think increasingly they're aware that there's not a great deal that can be done. The Poles are not going to enter this. The Poles, in my judgment, have perhaps the best army in NATO. They're well-trained, well-disciplined, much better than the Western forces. And I think the Poles would fight very effectively. And the president of Poland, Nawrocki, has said, that's not going to happen on my watch. No more Polish soldiers will go into Ukraine. They've got at least 8,000 to 10,000 dead Polish soldiers lying in cemeteries in Poland right now. So I think it's made it very clear that's not going to happen. And again, if you don't have Poland with you, forget it. I mean, it's like saying, well, we're going to invade at this place called Normandy, but Britain's not available. I mean, it's literally that important. So if we understand that, if the Poles are not on board, it's not going to happen. Are you going to try and do it from the Baltic littoral? Well, going into the Baltic is sort of like going into your swimming pool in the backyard. Anything you put in there could easily be detected and sunk. So I don't see that happening. I don't think the Russians see that happening. And as they become more and more convinced of this, the probability of a much more decisive operation becomes inevitable. There are also on the outskirts that have gone in and out in small numbers of Kharkov. But Kharkov is one of these places that can wait. Odessa is far more important. Now, the good news for them is that they've taken it out of the picture from a logistical sustainment standpoint. That's good. But they still want it. It's a Russian-speaking city. And that would probably destroy any hope that remains in the West of any success that Ukraine might try to achieve. Again, but you've got to move forward, your air and missile defenses. You've got to build up your capacity logistically so that you can sustain over distance. There are a lot of things that have to be done. I think a lot of that is underway. But if you look at us, for instance, we didn't invest any time at all in thinking through carefully in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, the kinds of obstacles that we would confront logistically as well as operationally. As a result, this whole thing is an embarrassment. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. The war has become a huge embarrassment for us, which is one of the reasons that Donald Trump runs around making so many outrageous statements as a compensation for what is obviously clear and unambiguous strategic setback or defeat.
Well, in the Middle East, though, Trump tends to use, it seems, these negotiations as a tactic for buying time. And I'm assuming the same approach will be used against Russia. That is, the Europeans now, according to New York Times, they are noticing that things are not going well. Again, this whole optimism from NATO seem to have been based solely on these attacks on the Russian civilian infrastructure. That is wild bears, this e-commerce warehouses. That this is how we measured success essentially. But now that many are recognizing that things are going wrong, there's some reports that the Europeans wouldn't mind the U.S. to restart talks with the Russians. That would be a shift from last year, because then they were quite unhappy of any talks. But of course, the Europeans do not want an actual end to the war. I think the European leaders want a pause so they can reorganize, re-equip, and prepare the Ukrainians for another round in the war. But how do you see the possibility of restarting diplomacy? Because again, it's a bit like with the Iranians. Whenever things go very wrong, there's a tendency to reach out and seek to start talks, either genuinely or to buy time.
Well, if you're a Russian right now at the top and you're working for Foreign Minister Lavrov or President Putin or the current defense minister, the advice I think they would get is, look, set it up, let them talk, but pay no attention and prosecute this war with a vengeance. This is evidence for the weakness that we've identified. Now's the time to exploit it and strike it hard. That's what I think. There are many Russians at very high levels telling their leaders. This we can talk and talk and talk as long as they like. We know they're not sincere. There's no reason whatsoever for us to trust anything coming out of the mouths of any of the people currently in power. And oh, by the way, we Russians have been patient, waiting for these governments to fall. And clearly the government in Berlin is much, much closer to that than it has ever been before. That's very obvious. And there are a lot of Russians who are watching this carefully, I'm confident. I've already explained that Poland doesn't want anything to do with the war against Russia over Ukraine. Absolutely none. So if you're a Russian, fine, talk. Let's get this on the road and get it done. Now, if you move down to the Middle East or to Persia or Iran, how many times do they have to be lied to before they finally say, well, this is pointless? I think it's over. And if you look at the new leadership, if you go through and look at the individuals who've been appointed to key positions inside Iran, and there are many articles out there, Artem Moini is an expert on this sort of thing, and he can explain in detail the backgrounds. But these are people who are hardly amenable to a negotiated settlement. I mean, these are people who've lost family members going all the way back to the Iran-Iraq war. And we in the United States, we never even bring it up. We don't even mention it. 500 to 750,000 casualties, hundreds of thousands of dead. And most of the people had relatives who fought in that war. It's as meaningful to them as, say, World War II was for us. I remember when we turned Okinawa, at least the sovereignty issue was resolved, and Okinawa was turned over to the Japanese, and the Japanese then agreed to let us stay. I think that's going to end pretty soon as well. It's a different subject. I think this whole overseas garrisoning construct is going to fall apart. We don't need it. It costs too much, and nobody wants it. But the bottom line is that for the moment, I think the Iranian attitude is screw you. We're not even going to bother talking to you. Now, I understand that Jared Kushner is insisting there are talks at lower levels. I have no idea what that means. And I have learned not to believe anything that he or Netanyahu or Witkoff or Trump say. I mean, I just don't. And then you have this emotional knee-jerk reaction to everything. The South Koreans would not support us in our position on Ukraine or something, and suddenly Trump pulls the plug on a joint exercise that we conduct on an annual basis with the South Koreans. He thinks he's punishing them. The people of South Korea would like us to get out. We've been there long enough. This government doesn't need us, doesn't want us. There is no imminent threat from North Korea because the Chinese will not tolerate it. They will not permit a war on the peninsula. And the Russians aren't going to push it because whatever happens in Asia, they will always defer to Xi, as well they should. So the bottom line is that I don't see any negotiations of any kind making any difference to anybody anymore. And I think an awful lot of that rhetoric is for consumption in the West. Consumption at home by people in the United States. I still run into people and say, oh, wow, Trump, he's playing 4G chess. No, he's a genius. You don't understand. He's creating a new architecture. Well, he's certainly contributing to the emergence of a new architecture, but it's certainly nothing that's necessarily in the interest of the American people. And it's destroying most of our partners, strategic partners in the region. So, it's frustrating dealing with people like that, but we have a lot of them. And until, sort of like this question, mein Führer, was mit dem endgültigen Sieg, in 1945. And Hitler looks at this person like, what are you, an idiot, and walks away. What about the inevitable victory? This is all crap. It's all going to collapse sooner rather than later. And I don't know how Donald Trump will deal with it. The smart way to deal with it is to recognize something that I hear all the time. I had a friend just came back from northern New York. He was up along the border with Canada and down in Utica and Albany. He said, nobody up there even cares what happens in Iran. Nobody gives a damn. They said, what are we doing over there? They're all worried about what? Inflation, the rise in prices for everything. And that's a pretty grim outlook. If you look at the markets right now, I think we're going to go up, and there's going to be something similar to what we saw in 29, a dramatic, steep decline. And, the diesel is really hitting Europe really hard now. I mean, I have friends in the Balkans and Hungary and Austria and Germany, and they're telling me, diesel's going through the roof. Diesel keeps everything rolling, as we know. How do you keep the things operating? How do you keep the electricity running for all the trains? And we could go on and on and on. Well, here it's not as bad as it is there, but it's getting there. And I don't see how we cope. We now have a 30-year Treasury bond that's selling for over 5%. It's so like 5.2 or 5.3%, something like that. I think the 10-year Treasury bond, which is the thing that everybody watches as the bellwether of real disaster, is up to 4.72 interest. Once that hits 5% interest, we're finished with this sovereign debt. We can't cope. And what's interesting is to watch the interest rates rise and the yields rise. That doesn't happen normally. It's the opposite. One goes up, the other goes down. Not a good sign. I don't think Mr. Besant can play the shell game that he's been playing too much longer before, we're in trouble, real trouble.